I'll be speaking on holiness. Holiness. And I want us to check the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 15, verse 11. Now, from Exodus chapter 15, verse 11, the Bible reveals that God is glorious in holiness because the glory of God is revealed in holiness. You can't carry God's glory in your life if you are not living a life of holiness. Exodus chapter 28, verse 36. There, the Bible shows that holiness is directional. Holiness has a direction. Now, it has a direction because it must be unto the Lord. So when we say holiness, holiness unto what? It is holiness unto the Lord. So any form of life you live, no matter how acceptable it may be before men, if you know if it is not directed towards God, then it cannot reflect holiness because holiness has a direction. It is usually unto the Lord. Anything that does not point to God cannot be called holiness. First Chronicles chapter 16, verse 29. There, the Bible speaks of the beauty of holiness. The beauty of holiness here means the demands of holiness. Two of the demands of holiness are consecration and purity. There are other demands, anyways, but two of them are consecration and purity. Anytime we worship outside the demands of holiness, then it means we have not worshipped in the beauty of His holiness. The word beauty in this context means demand. So when we say beauty of holiness, we are talking about demands of holiness. When there is a demand, there is supposed to be a supply. So if you understand that holiness has a demand, it will create in you a sense of responsibility. Are you getting what I'm saying? We must also note that consecration is one of the demands of holiness. Purity is one of the demands of holiness. Second Chronicles chapter 20, verse 21. It shows that we can also praise the beauty of God's holiness. There is a beauty that surrounds God's holiness, and this beauty deserves to be praised. The word beauty in this context means acts. When you see the acts of God's holiness, it must lead you into praises. One of the acts of God's holiness is to fight everything that brings defilement. For instance, when Uzzah tried to hold the ark of God, which was supposed to be, which he was not supposed to hold, it was the act of God's holiness that killed him. In the book of Numbers, when two young men went straight to the holy altar of God to kindle a strange fire, the Bible recorded that they died on the spot. That was also another act of God's holiness. The act of God's holiness, which is also the beauty of God's holiness, always functions to protect the sacredness of God's presence. There are many other examples in the Bible where we can find the act of God's holiness at work. So, the act of God's holiness always functions to fight everything that can bring defilement to the name of the Lord. Second Chronicles chapter 31, verse 18. Here we can see that sanctification must be done in holiness. If what you did is not done in holiness, then it cannot be called sanctification. That's why the priest will always ensure, the priest in the olden days, they will always ensure they are holy before trying to sanctify the people. You can't sanctify others when you are not sanctified. And that sanctification must be done in holiness, which means that it must be done according to the prescription of God. Psalm 30, verse 4. There, the Bible encourages us to always remember the holiness of God, and the reason is that it will help us to give thanks to Him. When you know God is holy, then thanking Him will become easy. Many of us do not remember the holiness of God. And because we cannot remember the holiness nature of God, it became hard for us to praise Him. It became hard for us to give thanks. Thanksgiving becomes easy the moment you have the understanding of the holiness nature of God. So it will mean that one of the cure to lack of thanksgiving is an understanding of the holiness of God. There is something about the understanding of God's holiness that brings us into thanksgiving. Psalm 47, verse 8. God has a throne called holiness. It is from this throne that He judges and reigns over the people of the earth. If you are not concerned about living a life of holiness, then that is a sign that you have another ruler different from God, because God reigns over the people of the earth from His throne of holiness. The implication of God sitting on this throne is that as long as God is on the throne, nothing will be called acceptable except it is done in holiness. The mountain of God's holiness is still the same as the holiness throne of God. Every throne is usually elevated. It is that throne that the Bible sometimes refers to as mountain. So you can have mountain of God's holiness, which also means the throne of God's holiness. You can see that in Psalm 48, verse 1. God also speaks from this throne. You can see that in Psalm 60, verse 6. If God makes covenant with you by His holiness, then what is actually being referred to is His throne. So that means God has made a covenant with you by His throne. And you can see that in Psalm 89, verse 35. Also in Psalm 93, verse 5, there the Bible made us to understand that God does not only sit on the throne of holiness, He also lives in holiness. That is God's eternal house. God does not only sit on the throne of holiness, He lives eternally in holiness. That's why we must worship God in spirit and in truth, meaning we must worship God in holiness in order to gain acceptance. I pray the Lord will help us in Jesus' name.